I'm Phil the Blythe, and I'm ready to get spooky. I highly recommend checking out my video on divination before this one, because this topic is wholeheartedly interconnected with divination. Honestly, it's just an expanded form of divination, so there are certain things that I'm not going to go super in depth in that I go in depth in that video right over here. Oh, so what is today's topic? Well, glad you asked. It's necromancy. Before I launch into the absolute blast I had researching for this video, I'm going to give a general content warning. This episode will talk a lot about death and dying and all the things associated with that. Funerals, ghosts, graves, sacrifice, bones, bodies, blood. Although I won't go into any graphic detail on any of those matters, just know that they will inevitably come up. So don't make the assumption that this video will be a downer. The main secondary source I used for this was surprisingly hilarious. Being induced or being influenced dreams were regarded as false or corrupt, but the role as dream-inducing or influencing may have been regarded more positively in a properly necromantic context. Indeed, perhaps it was thought that one could experience the soul of a dead person in a dream, specifically by ingesting it in a bean. What? Just next time I eat a bean, that's all I'm going to be thinking about. Am I eating the soul of a ghost? Notes on the sources. There's a couple of problems we run into immediately when talking about necromancy, and here are the three main issues: source genre, source time period, and source bias. As I mentioned in my divination video, we have a lot of literary sources for necromancy in the Homeric and classical age, but not a lot of evidence for how it was done in real life. A lot of them are literary and often in the realm of high tragedy and fantasy. This doesn't mean that they are useless, we just have to look at them with a critical eye. Source time period. Another issue with the sources for ancient Greek necromancy is the time frame. I try to stick mostly in the classical age with some elements of Homer and Hellenistic, but the problem with necromancy is that sourcing for it in the classical age beyond literary sources is less than scant. Literary sources are fine, but that'd be like an archaeologist looking back on society in the 20-teens and 2020s, and the only surviving media was Marvel movies. So I know I don't actually like comparing myth and religion to modern fiction and fantasy. That could be a whole other video on why not, but for sake of ease, I'll just go along with this metaphor. You still learn quite a bit about the world, just have to suss out what was belief, what was praxis, and what was author's creative interpretation. Unlike most of my videos, this video will actually primarily focus on the Hellenistic age. This is where we get abundance of necromancy sources from, and in case you've missed like any of my videos, the Hellenistic age, and folks who've watched for a while can probably say it along with me. Hellenistic age is from the death of Alexander the Great to the rise of the Roman Empire. The Greek religion became heavily influenced by Near East philosophy, Comedicism, and Judaism. If you'd like me to do a whole deep dive on the Hellenistic era, let me know. There's a lot to unpack there that I cannot do in this video. Why I'm even talking about the Hellenistic era is that some of it can actually be retroactively applied to the classical era. After all, these ideas couldn't have possibly just sprung fully formed as they were, and there are elements of like necromantic rituals from even as far back as the Odyssey. This is where scholarly guesswork comes into play. If you saw my research and resources video, you'll know that historically, scholarly guesswork can do a lot more damage than good. I like to think that we've gotten better about this, at least in the scholarly field, although from what I've seen on Witch Talk, so I will not be using my own scholarly guesswork, as I'm not a classicist and don't feel like taking on that responsibility of coming up with something that I'm not getting my thesis in this, like I did all this in a couple weeks. So instead, I will be primarily focusing on the work of Daniel Ogden and his book, Greek and Roman Necromancy. When talking about the Hellenistic sources and spells, most of the practical necromancy in this video will be coming straight out of the PGM. If you don't know what the PGM is, I've mentioned it a few times now. It's the Greek magical papyri. Why is it not the GMP? Well, The answer is Latin. And something is needlessly complex, the answer is usually Latin. The PGM is a collection of ceremonial spells, rituals, you name it, from the Hellenistic period up through the early Christian period. My third and final issue with the sourcing is source bias. A lot of necromantic sources come from the Christians. This might be a surprise to some of you, but if you've ever done any research into trad witchcraft, it happens a lot. Except with this case, you actually have pagan authors rebutting some of these, and it's not just like, there are witches amongst us. They were kind of writing hot takes against each other. Many of the Christian sources loved to talk about pagan necromancy and how they were like summoning demons and eating the entrails of children. Ironically, they actually liked to do necromancy. There's a whole other set of texts on just early Christian necromancy, so. The problem with these kinds of sources are obvious. They're propaganda, usually making the other look inferior and evil, while the right group looks superior and goodly. It can be complicated when these are the only sources we have. Celtic and Norse recons really know this pain. These kinds of sources often have shreds of truth in them, but these have to be like distilled out and taken with a heavy grain of salt. So that's a whole beast unto itself. The last thing I will mention is that I did say most of my work, most of my research came from Daniel Ogden's Greek and Roman necromancy. I did look a little bit at other sources, but honestly most of them were either cited by or cited Daniel Ogden. Felt kind of redundant to look at these things. So now we are getting into it. Defining necromancy. Now that I've talked about the problem of sources, let's talk about more problems, like the problem of defining necromancy. Some of you might be freaking out, like, oh my god, his fella telling us how to raise a zombie army and unleash it upon your enemies. No, it's not really what necromancy is. That might be our modern understanding of necromancy, but that's not what it was in its early form. Necromancy merely just means divination by spirits, usually spirits of the dead, although it can refer to things like more volatile spirits, malevolent spirits, or sometimes just earthly spirits or earthly deities. Later on, and especially in the Hellenistic period, necromancy does actually get a little bit of the reanimation aspect. However, it's primarily reanimation for divination and not for like raising a horde of zombies and battling it out Night King style. There are literary cases of witches doing this, especially those Thessalian ones linked to Hecate. Although gross and graphic forms of necromancy are not entirely literary, which is a bit unfortunate. In the PGM, we do have examples of reanimation, and some of them are just, wow, I was reading some out loud to my housemates, and I was like, some of them I couldn't even read out loud. They were just so, yeah. Just know that that wasn't like the common form of necromancy, though. Some people who did dark magic have existed, and also sometimes they were just doing it to be dramatic. The way that I will be defining it is necromancy being primarily divination by spirits. We're going to go through who, what, when, where, why, how. We're going to start with who. Let the dogs out! Is doing necromancy. Educated aristocratic men. Kelsipres, primarily educated and wealthy men, were the ones who were doing necromancy. This is kind of seen throughout the history of ceremonial magic, which necromancy would fall into. Hellenism is complicated in that it doesn't fall squarely within ceremonial or folk traditions, because it's kind of like a mix of both, with certain traditions being solidly in one or the other, like the example of the evil eye, definitely be a folk tradition. Something like necromancy, definitely ceremonial, so it's interesting that they kind of intermix in that way. What's interesting too is necromancy is actually one of the ones where we see a lot of women. Now granted, a lot of these women are witches and evil, or just considered malevolent, but it is interesting that there is mention of a lot of them. Most of these people, though, who were doing necromancy on a regular basis were on the fringes of society, even if they were wealthy and eccentric, or like a lot of times the wealthy and eccentric people would seek out a necromancer. Some of these people were so far outside the common religion that they were part of various mystery cults, like the Pythagoreans, Orphics, and individual magicians, which I will talk about now. Despite the fact that they pretty much hated literally everything to do with death, to the point where they won't even look at a gravestone, a lot of our sources on necromancy come from Pythagoreans and Orphics. Pythagoreans followed the teachings of Pythagoras. Yes, that Pythagoras. The one whose theorem you learn in math class. And Orphics followed Orpheus, perhaps one of the original mythic necromancers, as he tried to bring his wife Eurydice back to life, but screwed the pooch when he decided to look back. Although their form of necromancy was a lot more cerebral and less physical, as I will get into. And what about the common folk? The common religion. Most forms of necromancy as a whole were viewed pretty skeptically by religious and philosophical thinkers and regular people. However, as I mentioned, Odysseus and Orpheus, two mythic heroes, engaged in necromancy. It's also prevalent in the Aeneid and various plays. People were not necessarily afraid to engage the help of a necromancer, especially in cases of possessions, restless ghosts, or seeking them out in sanctuaries for the dead, but the vast majority of folks were not doing heavy necromancy themselves. I feel like that would make everyday life a little untenable if you and all your neighbors are summoning ghosts in the middle of the night to divine your future. Definitely did happen, but again, not as common. So what? What were they actually doing? Well, there's a couple of whats for us to explore here. Evocation rituals, Hellenistic spells, reanimation, and curse tablets are the main workings you will find. Basic necromantic rituals had several main parts as outlined by Daniel Ogden, and a lot of these rituals are echoed both in spell books of the PGM and all the way back to literary references of Homer, like Zig-Zamanenekuya, the necromancy sequence in Book 11 of the Odyssey, warning mentions of animal sacrifice and blood. On Girki's instructions, Odysseus digs a pit, Bothros. He pours libations around it to the dead, first of a mixture of milk and honey, second of sweet wine, and third of water, and then he sprinkles barley on top. He prays to the dead, promising to sacrifice to all of them on his return home the best sterile heifer of his herd, and to burn treasures on a pyre for them. To the ghost of the prophet Tiresias, with which he particularly wishes to speak, he promises a separate sacrifice of his outstanding all-black ram. With his bronze sword he opens the neck of a pair of black sheep, male and female, holding their heads down toward the underworld while turning his own face in the opposite direction. He lets their blood flow into the pit. At this point, the ghosts gather. Odysseus orders his companions to flay the sheep and burn their bodies, and to pray to Hades and Persephone. All the ghosts are eager to drink the blood, which will give them the power of recognition and speech. So Odysseus must use his sword to ensure that only the ghost with whom he wishes to converse approach it. Ogden breaks down this ritual and a lot of other evocation rituals seen from literary sources into several essential parts: purification, time and place of consultation, pit and fire, libations, sacrifice, utterances, and management of spirits. Purification. As in most aspects of Hellenism, purification is one of the most important rites. I cover it in depth in my purification and cleanliness video right over here. Necromancy, given that it deals with death and the chthonic, usually requires heavy purification. It's not a simple wash your hands and you're done kind of deal. Time and place of consultation. When one thinks of necromancy, the first thing that comes to mind is it's midnight, a full moon on a graveyard. And while that actually was kind of common in necromancy, so not entirely off the mark. Although the ancient Greeks also thought that midday, so noonish, or the sun is in that middle point, was also a liminal time, as there are a lot of stories, ghosts of soldiers spontaneously appearing to scare farmers at noon. It's mentioned so many times. While graves were an ideal spot for necromancy, rituals regularly took place at places sacred to the underworld, like lakes, caves, as is the case with Odysseus. I'll talk more in depth about places when I get to the where category. Pit and fire. It's never a ritual until some sort of bonfire is involved, am I right? Necromancy is no different. If you watch my altar shrines and sacred spaces video, you'll know that a bothros, a pit, was almost an essential part of chthonic worship, given that necromancy had to do with the dead. The best way to get to them is to meet them part way. This was also a central spot to pour blood and libations, and the fire could serve both protective and sacrificial properties. Speaking of libations. These were full offerings. If you watched my All About Offerings video, well, I'm just shilling myself today. No one else is I'm gonna do it. If you watch that video, you know that chthonic entities received whole sacrifices, unlike the partial and shared ones with the Uranic. So what kind of libations were offered? Here's a quote from Daniel Ogden. All the liquids used were distinctively propitiating and soothing, as Aeschylus says, or bewitching, and thereby able to summon the dead, as Euripides says. Water quenches thirst and bathes. Milk soothes babies. Honey sweetens. Wine is also sweet and ameliorates with inebriation. To Homer's liquids, Aeschylus adds olive oil, which is also soothing. The dead are real loud, and basically my cat at 6 a.m. and it's food time. You really want everything to be soothing so you can get words out of them that aren't just sacrifice and blood. Interestingly, animal sacrifice was, quote, not essential to the performance of the basic rites. However, just because it was not essential doesn't mean that it wasn't common. Usually it would be a pair of black sheep or goats, although the weirdos of the PGM got creative. Utterances. This is my favorite one. These actually had a couple of categories. Nonverbal utterances, prayers and incantations to the dead, prayers and incantations to chthonic deities, threats against the dead, threats against the gods, vows to the dead, vows to the gods, and words of power. Ever heard of Italian saint punishing? Hang a saint upside down until they give you what you want, bind them, bury them.
Stick them in a stew.
That stuff actually happens. The ancient Greeks were no strangers to this. They really loved to threaten the gods, and I've read some of these and they're like, I personally cannot imagine turning to Hecate and saying,
Your mother was a hamster and your father smelt of elderberries.
But they did that a lot. Also for nonverbal utterances, yeah, that's exactly what you think it is. Moaning, groaning, and even barking at ghosts. You can't make this up. Also, in terms of who they were invoking, the list goes from just Hades and Persephone in the Homeric, and the classical to Hades, Persephone, Earth, Hermes, Charon, Furies, Styx, Chaos, Elysium, Hecate, the Fates, Tartarus, Thanatos, Demons, Cerberus, Demeter, Chthonic Zeus, and Helios. Those are just the Greek ones. Management of ghosts. Once you summon these, how do you control them? Odysseus fends them off with his sword, which I'm not sure how that works given that they're incorporeal. Iron was also supposed to be binding. People would also fling milk at them, which I cannot recommend. Sometimes they bind them into dolls or statues. Some ghosts were more willing and otherwise reluctant. In fact, some were so willing that they wouldn't shut up about it and tell you even if you couldn't do anything. Hellenistic spells. Necromantic spells in the PGM are absolutely the wildest things I've ever read. I'll read a couple. A restraining seal for skulls that are not satisfactory for use in divination, and also to prevent them from speaking or doing anything whatever of this sort. Already off to a great start. Seal the mouth of the skull with dirt from the doors of a temple of Osiris, and from a mound covering graves. Taking iron from a leg fetter, work it cold and make a ring, on which have a headless lion engraved. Let him have, instead of his head, a crown of Isis. And let him trample with his feet a skeleton. The right foot should trample the skull of the skeleton. In the middle of these should be an owl-eyed cat with its paw on a gorgon's head, and a circle around them all these names, which I will not read out loud because I don't really want to summon anything. I have several questions. Are you trampling the skull with your foot? Is the skeleton trampling its own skull? Why are you restraining a skull that's not satisfactory for divination? Does it just blab incessantly and you're sick of it? I don't know. Here's another one. Resurrection of a dead body. I conjure you, spirit, coming in air, enter, inspire, empower, resurrect by the power of the eternal God this body, and let it walk about in this place. For I am he who acts with the power of faith, the holy God. Say the name. They all say, like, say the name, and I don't know what the name is. Your name, their name, the name of a god. But yeah, a lot of these are more condensed than the standard necromantic rituals like we saw. They depart dramatically from the structure. I mean, there's one where you shove a piece of paper written in like male myrrh, whatever that is, underneath the skull's tongue. Another one is a really, really complicated attraction spell that involves skull cups and donkey hides. They were like just so dramatic. Reanimation and curse tablets. Now for the big, scary, nefarious parts of necromancy. Reanimation spells are seen a lot in the PGM, I just read you one of them, and they're also common in late antiquity writings. What's important to note is that it's usually not a permanent reanimation like I mentioned. It's usually just a temporary and more extreme form of divination, and a bit more dramatic. The poets really, really enjoyed writing about reanimation, but it was probably not done all that often, given that, raising a dead body requires breaking a number of laws and cultural taboos, even for back then. Sometimes it's like only a partial body part was needed for reanimation, and it's unclear if they mean like, if I want to reanimate Jim so he can prophesy my future and fortune. If I have Jim's arm, is it just Jim's arm that comes to life? Or does his body catch up with him? Does he get a new spirit body? Given that the magicians of the PGM recommend doing things like rubbing saffron and coal into your eyes and staring into the sun until you see shadows, I'm not entirely sure I trust that any reanimation spell worked well enough for us to have an answer to that. Curse tablets. These were lead tablets with curses hammered into them, which then a ghost or another chthonic entity were supposed to carry out. How did it get to them? Well, they were buried in the ground. Yes, they buried lead in the ground. Then they wondered why Demeter let their crops fail that year. Curse tablets, however, were not just done by magicians on the fringe of society, they were done by everyday folk. These curse tablets, katadesmoi, were so common and abundant that people have written whole books on them. and it is even a side quest in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I'll cover them more in depth when I talk about ancient Greek magic in a future video. When were they doing it? I've already spoken a few times about times, midday, midnight, and time periods, Homeric to imperial to early Christian. But when is cause for necromancy? Well, when I find myself in times of trouble, I summon the ghost of my Grammy, shrieking words of wisdom. Besides the magicians who did it whenever they felt like it, common folks were more inclined to engage in necromancy during times of trouble, personal or national. Times of battle were probably the most prominent time for lay necromancy. There's plenty of stories of comrades, mothers, siblings, lovers going into battlefields to speak with or attempting to resurrect their lost loved ones, or soldiers randomly possessing people and, yes, terrorizing farmers again. This was actually such a big deal that there were laws placed on funerals, how many mourners you could have, how lavish the sacrifices, how defiled and dirty the mourners could be, how loud they could be, because, and I quote, "the fundamental justification for the limitation of the expression of grief is clear. If there's too much of it, one might bring the dead back." Forgot to start recording. And this is me just now realizing I forgot to turn on my audio, so the bit that's about to come is going to be a little bit different. Don't worry, I remember at some point. Where did necromancy take place? The prime site for necromancy and its conceptual home in the Greek and Roman worlds was the tomb, which served the living as the home of the ghost. A ghost was often believed to hover in the vicinity of its corpse's place of burial. The importance of tombs as sites for the exercise of control over ghosts is demonstrated by the many cursed tablets and puppets deposited into them. The tablets were addressed to the ghosts within, who were required to achieve, by means direct or indirect, the curse described. It comes as no surprise that the grave and the tomb is the most popular site for necromancy. I don't think I have to elaborate on that, so instead I will discuss interesting places of note, namely sanctuaries to the dead and entrances to the underworld. Necromantia, oracles of the dead, existed in the time of classical Greece and perhaps before. They were basically chthonic temples with a complex set of interiors. Many of them were by lakes, or in caves, and were frequented by common folk and tended to by priests. You would stay the night there, dream, and have an oracle interpret your dream in the morning, concept known as incubation. Entrances to the underworld. In the ancient Greek world, entrances to the underworld literally and physically existed. Odysseus ventured into one during the Nukia. For the living and the dead to be able to communicate, the barriers between them had to be dissolved. Necromancy could accordingly be conceived of as taking place in a space located between the world above and that below. This is why so many of the oracles of the dead were located at lakes or caves. It was thought if one traveled far enough, one would not only find an entrance to the underworld, but quite literally enter it. At home. Finally, some good old DIY necromancy. For the magician, a lot of necromancy took place at home. Giving you out a body part and grave dirt, you're all good to go. Why go to a dead body when you can bring a dead body home with you? Why were they doing it? Believe it or not, it wasn't all nefarious or self-interested. Necromancy was often done to free an area of restless ghosts, exorcisms, and bringing justice to those who had been murdered. I'd say a large portion of pre-Hellenistic necromancy was for this exact purpose. Ghost hunters have always been a thing, for better or for worse. However, this practicality was not the only reason. In On the Soul by Plato, he states, "Knowledge cannot be obtained in any circumstances except by the dead." This also explains why the Pythagoreans, despite their abhorrence of death, would engage in necromancy by engaging with the pure soul. They would divine things in the afterlife, the future, the past, the nature of the universe, from those whose souls had detached from their corrupt bodies. This was also the case with divinatory uses. Some people would seek spiritual answers about fate, life, truth, and love, while others sought more practical divination. Do they love me? When will I die? How can I seek my fortune? How will the war turn out? The dead were very wise, and sometimes considered more truthful than the gods, because they were compelled to speak the truth. Of course, there are plenty of examples of divination for less than lofty reasons. Where did you bury the treasure? Curse my brother who took my inheritance. If my real brother is watching, don't worry, I'm not cursing you, except in winter when I'm in a frozen wasteland and you're in the sun. How did necromancy even work? I decided to dive a little bit more into the theory, since this is certainly beyond Hellenism 101. There's a lot of scholarly debate about this because the primary method for receiving information seems to be incubation, doing a ritual, going to sleep, having a dream and then having that dream interpreted. This becomes confusing given the very act of words that are used to describe necromantic rituals. Do you lie down and take a nap mid-ritual and then finish out at the end? Or do you take a nap at the end after you've already finished up? Do you complete the ritual in your dream? There's another explanation, one beloved by Pythagoreans. That would be soul projection. Soul projection, related to astral projection, but I prefer the former term. It's more specific to this kind of trance work. Basically, it's what it sounds like. You project your soul out of your body and into the underworld. This was achieved through shamanistic rites of ecstasy, trance, sometimes with Hermes as a guide or protection. The goal was to enter a death and dreamlike state. This is seen throughout a lot of journeying and trance work. This is why I'm wary of modern astral projection discourse, because originally it was extremely difficult and excruciating to achieve. It was a death-like experience. It was literally the soul separating from the body, not just a simple visual meditation. In fact, Odysseus is greeted by Kirke as he of double death. Pythagoras believed that it was only once the soul had been purified that it could detach from the body and interact with gods through dreams and waking visions. Possession. Another way this would work was through voluntary possession or invocation, in which the ghost inhabits you or your ritual partner's body. You would give the ghost partial control of your voice and body in order to achieve what it was you were trying to achieve. You would then banish it and release it back from whence it came, or trap it forever in a vessel if you're a jerk, or a magician from the PGM. And honestly, that Venn diagram is just a circle. Scrying. Our good old friend scrying. I discussed scrying in more detail in my Divinations and Hellenism video. Also, Dot Darling, who I mentioned in that video, discussed scrying also really in depth, more from like the modern ceremonial, but honestly, it really hasn't changed that much. This was, I think, probably the primary method for necromancy. Basically, looking into a bowl of water, candle reflected in it, smoke reflected in it, oils in the bowl, and interpreting the signs that emerge. Modern practice. How would this work in modern practice? Personally, have not yet met a Hellenist who has done necromancy, at least none who have told me. I also have never done it before. I've met other occult practitioners who have done it, and I witnessed a ritual once. Disclaimer, it is not at all a beginner-friendly practice. If you don't know anything about protection, purification, spirit interaction, I'd recommend you get a handle on that first. It definitely has its place in modern practice, especially given a lot of ceremonial magicians do some form of necromancy. It's just not for everyone. Given the outline I gave on evocation rituals, I think a lot of this would be fairly easy to replicate. I don't recommend reanimating anyone or burying lead tablets in the backyard or grave robbing, but there are ways to simplify these rituals into something a little less intense and a lot more legal. If anyone has any experiences in necromancy that they'd be willing to share, please post them in the comments. I would love to hear about them. Anyway, thank you for sticking with me. I hope this was as fascinating for you as it was for me. Anyway. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.